Uh, it's an honor to introduce my colleague, Barry Bloom. Barry has devoted his entire career to fighting infectious diseases, especially those that disproportionately affect people in developing countries, in particular TB and leprosy. But Barry is a colossal figure in public and global health, whose work spans both the basic and mechanistic research, especially immunological research, as well as global health and global health policy. And recently, you probably, if you listen to NPR at all, you've heard him, and Barry's been, I would say, an authoritative and reassuring voice in the media over the past year during the COVID pandemic. Barry's research lab started at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which is parenthetically where I met him when I was a postdoc, and in one of his previous postdocs lab, where he was an HHMI investigator and chair of Department of Micro and Immuno. In 1998, he moved to the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where he was dean of the school for 10 years, and where he is currently Joan L. and Julius H. Jacobson Research Professor of Public Health. Barry has way too many awards and honors to mention here, but perhaps the two most notable are his membership in the National Academy of Sciences and National Academy of Medicine. His fundamental work on the cellular and molecular immune responses that protect us against TB and leprosy has been extremely influential in the field. And in addition, his impact on the field has been amplified due to his mentorship and training of numerous scientists, many of whom are now leaders in the field themselves. But moreover, when Barry started his career, there were very few people, very few labs studying TB in particular, which is very difficult to work with. And in my estimation, I think that Barry's work paved the way in leading a large interest in TB research, as well as NIH funding that started a little over 20 years ago and is still going strong. And so I think we have a lot to thank Barry for in that respect. Barry is also known for his work as an advisor and consultant with worldwide agencies, especially the WHO and others, where he has worked as an advisor for numerous committees, including those focused on TB, malaria, and other tropical diseases. He's also served as consultant to the White House, as well as many other institutions, including the NIH, where he continues to serve. And he's had an equally large impact on global health policy there as well. Barry, actually, when we were preparing for this, he reminded me that in 2001, he co-chaired a National Academy working group with Josh Lederberg on science and technology for countering bioterrorism, which was essentially to assess vulnerabilities in the response to 9/11 and the intentional release of anthrax that happened soon thereafter. And I recommend going back and reading that. Barry asked me to do that, and I did. And reading the recommendations of that committee, it's remarkable how many of the ideas they had back then to strengthen public health preparedness would have addressed many of the failures in the current US response to COVID that both Janet and Harold talked about this morning. I suspect we'll hear about some of these ideas in Barry's talk, which is entitled, Were We Prepared for a Pandemic? I think I have an answer to that one, Barry, but I'll let you give us your answer. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Barry, you muted.
There we go.
Yay. Thank you.
All right, now I have to go get the PowerPoint up. Okay, so I'm really honored and pleased to be here. It's been fun to be on a panel with my old college mate, Harold Varmus, and wonderful of Jeff to have thought of inviting me. In essence, Mark gave the answers to all the premises that I'm going to talk about. And the question that I thought became of personal interest, I'm not an expert on coronaviruses. I did work for a long time in global health and still do. But what got me into coronaviruses was a request in 2003 when China had done a poor job in dealing with SARS, to meet with the top 5 people in the Ministry of Health to find out what they did wrong and what they could have done better. And with a colleague who is now Dean of the Peking Union School of Public Health, we came up with a report that said basically the public health science was poor. It took them weeks to make a diagnosis of what the virus was. The data and communications within the public health system was failed, and the data were unclear, unreliable, and not shared even within the system, and risk communication with the public, what do you do in a pandemic, was hopeless. I could apply those same 3 recommendations or analyses to our response to COVID in 2020, I'm afraid. So what we know is we have had a lot of experience with pandemics on the planet. They're not surprises, they happen, whether it's in Athens, Rome, Europe, or Aztec civilization, or in the New World. We should not and cannot be surprised by pandemics. And as it was mentioned in Janet Napolitano's talk, in 1949, the Constitution of the World Health Organization confers the authority, the unique authority, to adopt regulations designed to prevent the international spread of disease. And as you can read here, this culminates in the need for the Director General for every state party, every country, to notify within 24 hours any event that could be of international emergency of concern. There's no incentive for any country to do that, because the minute you do that, you create an economic crisis. So their enforcement of these regulations is very difficult to achieve. And as you can see, it has to be an extraordinary event, which is at a public health risk for other states. Nonetheless, this is a unique authority, and WHO is the only UN special agency that has supranational authority. That is, it has the ability to quarantine a country, a product, a person that no other agency internationally can claim to. It has never used that authority. When one thinks about pandemics, the ones that we have most in modern times experience with is influenza. And what we know is they keep recurring. We know why they keep recurring, and we're not very good at predicting what new variants or strains would come out. But we know, as you'll see in a minute, they were serious. What's interesting and worth anybody's interest, the Russian pandemic in 1899 is unusual in that there were long haulers, which is very unusual, in fact, unique if it was actually flu, with psychological symptoms and weakness for months and years. And the question that was raised recently is, could that have been a preliminary attack from a coronavirus at that time? Whatever it is, as you'll see, there wasn't any immunity generated for the present. So what do we know about pandemics? And the textbook for all pandemics is the 1918 influenza outbreak. So the first thing is there were a single case diagnosed at a crowded medical facility in World War I in Massachusetts, my state. A week later, there were 6,000 cases. A week later, there were 12,000 cases, 727 deaths. The epidemic spread worldwide and infected a quarter of the population of the US and killed about 4% of the population in the world. Massive amount of deaths, far greater than war at that time. And in my dealings at the school with the press and the public to an extent, has been the difficulty of explaining the idea of exponential spread. It's very hard for people to imagine what's coming 3 weeks from now when you see very little today. And an example of this, from the first case that was reported, it took 3 months to get 1 million cases. And that exponentially is expanding, as you know, to astronomical numbers. And if you look at a country like India at the moment, once it gets exponential beyond obvious control, what do? These are the big hitters in pandemics: the Spanish flu, which wasn't Spanish, in 1918, the Asian flu of H2N2, and the Hong Kong flu of H3N2 took millions of lives. The 1918 flu is one of the few things that actually created an inflection point in global mortality. Its impact on the planet was extraordinary. One of the curiosities mentioned, I guess, by Harold, and I think correctly so, is all pandemics are local. They start local, they spread local. The R0 we talk about varies from day to day, from the R0 to an effective or a time-dependent replication factor. And that varies within even the 5 boroughs of New York City, widely across the city. So the question when one looked at the 1918 flu is, why was there such a difference between the outbreak in New York, in this case Philadelphia, and other cities in the country? And that enabled some of the smart epidemiologic modeling to go look at the classic influenza, for which there were extraordinary weekly data in each of these major cities, much better data than we had in the beginning of the coronavirus in the current period. And the papers by Richard Hachette and Mark Lipschitz and Howard Markel indicated that the only tool available there actually worked, which was controversial here. And these are the interventions that were introduced in various towns and cities across the United States. They have been quasi-quantitatively evaluated in the Hachette and Lipschitz paper. And I will show you that, that no city, while the non-pharmaceutical interventions were operative, had a second wave of infection. So when one looks at what the effects of these non-pharmaceutical interventions were, and 2 here that are particularly powerful, school closures and banning of public gatherings of a whole variety across the country. They did so well to bend the curve in the peak of the curve during the East that they let up their restrictions, as we have done in many times in this country for COVID, and within 2 weeks they got a spike. So one of the messages is, when the interventions are relaxed prematurely, you can count often to get a rebound and a new peak. And deciding when it is time and appropriate is the hard part. And there's no simple formula for that. I want to divert to another principle that is not totally irrelevant. And that's the swine flu that nobody cares much about, 1976 swine flu. On February 4th, a soldier died from flu. CDC isolated some strains, and they found that it was an H1N1 strain that the world hadn't seen since 1918. And the secretary of HEW announced, as you can see, that we were about to get the most virulent form of flu, and there is going to be a pandemic of devastating proportions. That led not to the CDC tracking it down, collecting more data, and doing what CDC usually does with outbreaks. That led to a phone call to the secretary of HEW to the president. President was running for election, and he convened a meeting in the White House and had several television interviews. Jonas Salk is on the left, and all the big hitters in Washington showed up for the event. And the president announced that we were going to have a massive campaign to develop vaccines against this flu. The fact of the matter is that only 200 people developed influenza. Only the index case died. There was no evidence, as it turned out, for human-to-human transmission. But because of all the luminaries, it became a big deal. And one of the curiosities for me is our leading politician involved in health at the time failed to show up, and that was Senator Kennedy. So what was the outcome of all of this? The government demanded companies to make vaccines. The companies refused or were holding back until the government agreed to cover all liability and all costs. And I have to say, with millions of childhood vaccines provided every year prior to this, the United States has never assumed government liability for production of stuff from vaccine companies. And that's a very important precedent. A quarter of the people in the country received vaccines, and about 450 people, a very, very small number, developed an adverse effect called Guillain-Barré syndrome. I got involved in that only because I was asked to be a witness for the people who were trying to sue the government, and also a witness for the government. And I declined because there wasn't enough data anywhere to support the plaintiffs or the government for causation. Because of the hype about the adverse effects, vaccinations were stopped. Ford lost the election to Jimmy Carter, and the head of the CDC was replaced. Now, I take some lessons for that, which was why I put it in my talk. And the first is, I think people take public health for granted. In fact, they don't even take it for granted. They even know, for the most part, what we do in public health. In 1996, Gallup polls took a poll through Research America, asked whether people would pay $1 a week for biomedical research, and 77% of the people said they would. The same year, they asked, do you know what public health is? And 7% said yes. So while we're not well understood, decisions in public health have high stakes. And the second has to do with the question is why Senator Kennedy didn't attend. And my friend and colleague Arthur Silverstein, an immunologist at Hopkins, spent a year as an advisor to Senator Kennedy, a FASEB fellow. And when I asked him why Kennedy was not there, his answer was the most important role for a staff person, he said it in less kindly words, is to protect his or her boss. That's an important lesson for anybody who is an advisor or staff person within any level of government. Then when you look at policy planning, I would say where things began, at least for my understanding, was about 1992 when the National Academy of Institute of Medicine then wrote a report called Emerging Threats to Infection. I actually wrote the summary chapter for that. And that caught on with the press. And there was a lot of interest in the public on emerging infections, but nothing, to my knowledge, of significance happened at the policy level. And I was so frustrated, particularly if you working on vaccines for tuberculosis and leprosy and people and my colleagues in malaria, that we were just not even prepared to do any of that, let alone deal with plagues and emerging infections. I wrote a piece in Science in 1994. I liked it a lot. I don't think I've ever written anything that had a lesser impact than this piece. But it proposed that just what you heard from Mark, there had to be a public-private set of collaborations, a government-industry cooperation to take care of risks and a resolution of a whole slew of issues with liability and whatever. And it proposed two things that I think were then and are now crucial that were dealt with for COVID in a remarkable way. no year funds is the hardest money to get in Washington. Congressmen spend money so that they have patronage and can get recognized for what they've done. Putting money in a bank in an emergency fund doesn't actually help the career of any of our government officials. And yet that is absolutely essential if you have an epidemic, given the difficulty of getting any legislation with new money through Congress. That's not a way to deal with epidemics and pandemics. And second, it was unusual to propose in a totally private industry at the time that if they wouldn't undertake the risks, the government had to do that. Things changed, however, and that was with September 11th, the World Trade Center, and the anthrax letters on September 18th. And all of a sudden, people became aware there were great threats to this country that had not taken that possibility seriously. And in the booklet that Jeff had mentioned, I was privileged to co-chair the panel with Joshua Lederberg on human and agricultural health. The real texts of the reports are not in the book. Many of them were classified, others were put down into brief form. But the outcome of this booklet, I think, very clearly indicated at every level of security, the United States was enormously vulnerable. In terms of energy systems, I remember someone saying 2 guys on a bicycle with a wire cutter could shut down the power in a quarter of the United States. And the floods in Texas, the snowstorm indicated that's probably not that far off. So we are vulnerable. So how did the science that we are so proud of, how did that get developed and where did it come from? And my thesis here is the public has worried, possibly because of the term Operation Warp Speed, the public has been worried about, is this too fast? Have we just done something so quickly we can't understand really the implications of what we've done? And my case that I will try to make to you is we've been at this a lot longer than people thought. From the point of view of the government, NIH has been investing in research, but in 2003, when SARS hit, there were only 2 grants at the NIH, if I remember correctly. But in 2001, the Defense Advanced Research Planning Projects Agency started to invest in new technologies to prepare against infections. The Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority was created and invested in producing anthrax and smallpox vaccine stockpiles, they being the most obvious and the most deadly bioterrorist agents. In 2006, the National Vaccine Influenza Pandemic Plan was created, about which I will speak a bit later. BARDA then began to fund drugs and vaccines with companies and develop broad partnerships with industry, and that was a very unique and important development. Surprisingly to people where we're talking about RNA vaccines being invented yesterday, no, they weren't invented in 2011. But as you'll see, the key experiment that made it possible was invested in by DARPA and the NIH. And then DARPA and BARDA in 2017 set as a priority for the United States to be able to develop a new vaccine to any viral pathogen within 60 days. And as you know, the Moderna vaccine was made after the cDNA sequence was put up by the Chinese on the 10th of January. 63 days later, the vaccine was in the arms of the first volunteer recipient in Seattle. At the global level, there was a recommendation, an influential paper by 3 serious vaccine advocates, Stanley Plotkin, Adel Mahmoud, and Jeremy Farrar, saying nobody's going to make vaccines for viruses that aren't here. And by the time they're here, or pathogens that are here, it's too late, or often too late. And nobody's going to make vaccines against malaria and TB and other parasitic diseases, we need a new mechanism. And that's when the Coalition for Emerging Pathogen Innovation, CEPI, was created largely by the Norwegians with a push from Jeremy Farrar and Bill Gates. And this is the transformative conceptual framework. They started about guessing which is the next new endemic or pandemic that's going to come. That's not a useful exercise in my view. It hasn't worked very effectively except for flu, and we could never guess which strain. They bought into the idea of creating platforms, one of which from their beginning was on nucleic acid vaccines. And so we have Operation Warp Speed. We have platforms that weren't invented for COVID. They were applied to RSV, MERS, Zika, and influenza, as well as efforts in cancer. And that required 3 different platforms. One is the mRNAs, one is recombinant adenos, and one is growing in high efficiency proteins in insect cell cultures. And in the area of government industry partnerships, the idea of advanced market commitments, which had been worked out by the Gates Foundation for pneumococcal vaccines, guaranteed a price if the vaccines were approved and licensed. These were advanced market commitments that then fixed the price to the public sector from the companies. And in the case of COVID, with an enormously, I think, courageous investment, a very large amount of money, 10 billion, to get Warp Speed off the ground. But really, where did the new vaccines come from? And this would be my favorite first paper, that is from Catalin Carrico, who had been trying to get RNA to do things to cure cancer for years, could not get an NIH. And Drew Weissman at Penn has been trying to get DNA vaccines to work for years and managed to create a partnership that kept her in business and enabled them to find something really important, that RNA, mammalian RNA, is highly toxic. It stimulates unacceptable innate immune responses and could not possibly be used usefully as a vaccine or a therapeutic. But what Catalin discovered was that if you modified the RNA, taking account that many RNAs that are modified with methylated bases are much less inflammatory, using a non-natural RNA base, pseudouracil, there you got a much lower inflammatory response and much longer RNA stability. And without that, we probably wouldn't have RNA vaccines. The second scientific background for this really came from Jason McClellan and people at the NIH, particularly Barney Graham and Peter Kwong initially, which is the equivalent, the F protein in respiratory syncytial virus, the spike protein, are floppy proteins, and they're not very good at immunizing. And they learned that if you put in 2 prolines in the right place, you could stabilize the proteins. And that became the basis for a prototype pathogen preparation for any virus with the equivalent of a spike protein, where it can be stabilized and one can create stable vaccines. And in all the RNA vaccines except AstraZeneca, it is the 2P modification and stable structure that has led to real vaccines and their ability to work. And that was obviously proved to be extraordinarily successful. And we have trials underway now for multiple other infectious diseases and cancer. So this was the background on RNA. It took a while from 2005. For the adenovirus vaccines, really depended on a study made by Graham and Smiley, working initially in Van de Abbe's lab in the Netherlands, but published from Michigan, showing that they could take fragments of DNA and transform embryonic cells into human cells into long-term culture and transform them to continuous growth. You can't grow viruses if you don't grow them in mammalian cells, and you need a stable, continuous cell line that is good enough and clean enough to be studied. That enabled them to knock out the replica, the early genes in the virus that were required for replication, so they could make replication defective viruses that could present antigens but couldn't grow and cause a disease. And now we have vaccines in human trials for at least 7 diseases, 2 of which are already in use in humans. At the policy level, there's some really critical decisions that have to be made when there is a question of a pandemic. And one of them is, should there be a response beyond epidemiological monitoring and surveillance? That's why I showed the 1976 report. That's a very heavy decision. And the question is, who has to make that decision? Is it the director of CDC? Is it the secretary of HHS? Is it the president of the United States? Is it the governors of individual states? Who's responsible for coordinating the 17 government agencies and 50 state responses with statutory responsibility to respond to an epidemic? Who decides when to close schools and put in the non-pharmaceutical interventions? Who decides whether the government should make drugs and vaccines possible, or whether that should be the business of the private sector, as it has almost always been for other diseases? And if so, who pays for the products? Should they pay in advance and make commitments, or should they subsidize as they did for Moderna because there wasn't enough money without a subsidy even to get a product? Who covers liability? A huge question for industry, not for most people. And then the question that Mark raised that we struggled with is, who receives priority for vaccines? And if you look at that set of questions, my answer would be, you got to have a plan. And I believe we had a plan, or at least the basis of a plan. And I think it's a remarkable document, which is why I included the links that almost nobody has ever looked at or read that I know of. These are just the summaries of the chapters of this plan that covers virtually everything that Mark talked about that the government would have to worry about if we were to respond intelligently, effectively, and rapidly to a threatened pandemic. It's a remarkable document. It set up an advanced infrastructure planning for surveillance, supplies, drugs, vaccines, delivery, infrastructure, reporting. A directorate was installed in the National Security Council, someone who had been a chief scientist at the FDA, and the White House, Beth Cameron, who's now back at the National Security Council, to coordinate the 17 government agencies that have responsibilities. It included no-year funds, starting at the beginning at $175 million. In the case of COVID-19, regrettably, it was ignored. The people in the White House were pushed out. Whether they resigned or were fired remains controversial. The emergency no-year funds, when we needed them, it turns out had already been spent. They weren't there, and we had to wait for months for Congress to allocate funds. So how would I reflect on all of this besides saying that I support everything that Mark presented? If we could do what he said, we would not have to go through this crisis again. But as you well know, Ronald Reagan's famous line is that I'm from the government and I'm here to help. We have seen what happens in COVID-19 when the government was not there to help, at least outside of the science realm. And so, and my view would be that in the face of an epidemic, we know, and Mark outlined, what's needed. You need plans, you need credible data, which we do not have. We need representative data that Lisa and Ava were trying to get in California, but we have no idea how representative most of the data that the states collect are. We need a trained workforce, which has been reduced by 25% at CDC, and they've got to be brought up to speed with modern epidemiology, artificial intelligence, and brought into the 21st century. You've got to have communications that is factual and consistent if you're going to get the public to accept interventions of drugs and vaccines and lockdowns. And there's need to be support for WHO, and I'm not sure if anyone mentioned the global health security efforts, which is independent of WHO, where if WHO politically with 194 members of the World Health Assembly, which is the governing board, can't get their act together, this is an independent group of 70 countries, sophisticated with modern understanding of endemics and bioterrorism. They should be able to make an international response. What one needs to get all of this done is credible and coordinated leadership. We have suffered from that in this country and virtually every other country. Brazil and India at the moment are those suffering the greatest from that. How to do that is not likely to be in the next white paper. My final perspective, I was privileged as a graduate student at Rockefeller to meet the guy who wrote the equation that underlay the production of the first atomic bombs. And this was his great line when he was asked by the press whether he was an optimist or not. And his answer, I think, is the only answer I can give at this point, is yes, I would be optimistic if an optimist is defined as someone who believes the future is uncertain. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Barry. Awesome talk. If people have questions, please put them in the chat. Barry, I was struck by when you mentioned about basically vaccine hesitancy, and that this idea that these newfangled vaccines are not likely to be accepted universally because people, and you hear it all the time, right? Is that is it too early? Do we know enough about them? Yet, in some respects, like what you're saying, is that this is not brand new technology. This has been worked on for quite some time. How do we communicate that effectively when there is some cachet, I think, for having some newfangled way of making a vaccine, and it certainly seems new to other people. How do we address that from a real world perspective of vaccine hesitancy and fighting that? So
I would say two things. There's a lot of work going on, as you know very well, on why are people hesitant. And I think the overwhelming response that everybody has is there are many, many different reasons. Some people don't like needle sticks. Some people don't trust their government. Some people believe that there are chips in vaccines because of misinformation and disinformation. I can only say that we have a press call every week, many days a week, with members of the serious press, both television and radio and print press. And the point that I try to make is exactly that. There's a science underpinning that are not fly by night, that people have worked for dozens of years to establish a credible scientific and safety basis for the vaccines that have come out of this. That history doesn't get much play in the newspapers, as you know, or on the radio. It's all yesterday's news. But certainly I do my best to try to get that message across. I think social media should play a role in there too, right? Of getting those messages across. I think more people now are getting. You should know I don't have a Facebook account.
Neither do I. So I was also struck by this idea, right, that there are very few or no incentives for countries to report. There are ways to think about how one could incentivize or at least lower that disincentive for early reporting.
I think it's very difficult because it is so clear to the leaders of countries that if you declare that you have an epidemic disease, the impact on the economy, even without lockdowns, even with Ebola, if you can shut it down, is absolutely enormous. So all the scientific reasons to get out in front of an epidemic depend on both the leadership and the public understanding the implications of exponential growth. And that, I find, is the one baseline scientific fact that very few people anywhere in the world, and least of all people in policy positions, have any idea of. When the president of the United States says we have only 5 cases, and every epidemiologist at our school was saying it has to be 500 to 5,000 cases and it will go away. It won't go away if we have 500 cases. If we have 1 case, it would be 65,000 cases in a few months. So that is the message, that if we were to teach kids in kindergarten from K to 12, one thing about infectious diseases, that's what they should understand.
And we elect people who deal in reality. Are there any questions from the group?
I guess I have a question. You know, you showed the really amazing plan for influenza, and I can't even imagine how much work went in there and how much thought, and seeing how this gets disregarded after so much time was spent developing a good framework. How do what do you say to scientists now? I mean, all of us have research programs to work on, but we also need to inform, I think, policy and public decision making. But then some people are discouraged because they think it's not worth it to begin with, or it's just a lot of effort, and then in the end it just gets ignored. How can we make sure that scientists' advice is not, just taken at certain times and other times completely ignored?
The simple answer is by voting.
Yeah.
In the sense that I'm sure almost every senator has a staff person like my friend Arthur to advise them. But the extent to which each of those is connected to the frontier of what the best scientists know about and what they care about, and what the advisors care about is economics more perhaps than health. That's a dichotomy that got loose in this and probably every other pandemic, and certainly got loose in India. It is politically difficult to make the hard decisions. And you really have to be trusting of the science. When Mark Lipschitz says what you see today is only what was decided 3 weeks ago, and it will get exponentially worse 3 weeks from now, that's a hard message for the politicians to want to hear. And then you have 1976 where it went away. So guessing right is part of the business.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? All right. Thank you, Barry, for a wonderful talk, and so much information and really my thought-provoking ideas. So it was really a pleasure to have you. Thank you.